Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into a place that, well, for many, it's the very definition of paradise.
Hmm.
Think dramatic volcanic mountains, incredible lushness, and those iconic pitons, genuinely one of the most photographed spots on the planet.
Absolutely.
We're talking about Saint Lucia, a gem in the Lesser Antilles, known for this stunning natural beauty and a really vibrant blend of Afro-Caribbean, French, and British cultures.
And our sources today mentioned is actually one of the few Caribbean islands still relatively untouched by the kind of mass commercialization you see elsewhere, which is quite something.
It really is. So to understand this unique place, we've got some fantastic material provided by you, our listener.
That's right, yeah. It includes a brief history document by Dr. Afisavad Chayapolfut,
Right.
Sirivadhanawar, plus excerpts from other related writings. Quite a stack.
Our mission to go through this stack, basically pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight, figure out the major forces that shaped St. Lucia, and, get a clear picture of where it stands today.
Exactly. It's about giving you that well-informed shortcut, maybe with some surprising facts along the way that make the journey worthwhile.
Okay.
So let's start by grounding ourselves in the geography, because the island's landscape plays such a huge role in its story.
Makes sense.
The sources describe St. Lucia as intensely volcanic and mountainous, with peaks like Morning Gimme and Morne Tufay.
Right.
The climate is tropical warm year-round, typically around 30 degrees Celsius, thanks to the trade winds.
Which sounds lovely, but it also means a distinct wet season, right? May to November.
Yes, bringing heavy rain and, significantly, the risk of hurricanes. That's a constant factor.
Yet this environment also supports incredibly rich flora and fauna. I noticed the sources even point to birdwatching as a notable tourist activity.
They do, which tells you a lot about the natural wealth here.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, digging into the very earliest history from these sources, archaeological findings suggest human presence as far back as 3300 BCE.
Wow, that's early.
It is. The first identifiable group mentioned is the Ciboney, arriving maybe between 4000 and 3000 BCE.
Okay.
They're described as, well, likely nomadic hunter-gatherers, and honestly, they left very little behind, mostly just primitive stone tools found at quarrying sites.
So, not a lot to go on there.
Not really. Then came the Arawak. They migrated northward around 2000 BCE and appear in St. Lucia around 800 BCE.
Okay, and this was a bigger deal.
Oh yeah, this was a huge shift. The sources say they brought agriculture, pottery, a more settled, developed lifestyle that actually thrived for a while.
There's always a but in history, isn't there?
Seems like it. Their migration was apparently driven by pressure from another group, the Caribs.
Ah, the Caribs.
Originating in the Amazon basin, arriving in St. Lucia around 1000 AD. The sources contrast them sharply with the Arawak, describing them as more advanced, yes, but also significantly more aggressive.
And their impact.
Devastating, according to these texts, driving out or killing the Arawak, who essentially vanished from the island's history by 1450.
Wow. Just gone.
Yeah, and the Caribs were no pushovers. The sources note they were skilled at boat construction and navigation.
Makes sense. They settled along the coasts, right? For seafaring.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But interestingly, they seem to have avoided the mountainous interiors.
Huh. Did the sources say why? Or hint at it?
They don't explicitly state a single reason, no. But you can sort of infer from their focus on coastal life and navigation, perhaps the mountains were less appealing or necessary for their lifestyle compared to groups maybe more focused on deep interior agriculture.
Okay.
What the sources really emphasize is their hostility towards Europeans. They became notorious for slaughtering sailors.
Why, did they say?
Apparently they were convinced the Europeans wanted to enslave them, which, given what happened elsewhere.
Yeah, that was a pretty accurate fear, unfortunately.
Sadly, yes.
Tell us about their culture, because the sources give us some interesting glimpses.
They do. It's described as matriarchal, with the chief being the Ubu. Polygamy was practiced, and they cared a lot about appearance, including tattooing. Their spiritual and cultural practices included sacrifices and prayer, with shamans holding considerable authority. Villages were made up of impermanent houses called oliva.
Right. And their daily life, what did they eat? What tools did they use?
Diet consisted of things like cassava, sweet potatoes, fish, and meat. Pretty standard for the region, really.
And tools.
Weapons. For tools and weapons, the sources mention ceramic items, baskets made from a stone called dolerite, which is interesting, bows and arrows, throwing sticks, club sticks, and stone axes. They had rich cultural practices, too. Dances, rites around childbirth, hunting festivals.
What stands out in the sources, for me anyway, is how deeply connected all these indigenous cultures were to their environment.
Oh, absolutely.
The land, the forest, the sea, even celestial bodies and guardian spirits. Fire, for example, was central and mythologized as a gift.
Yes, the sources really highlight that connection. Rituals for rain or harvests were important community affairs. Celebrations like harvest festivals were joyful.
And respect for nature.
Profound respect. Children were taught that animals weren't just resources, but almost like co-members of the community. Even natural objects like sticks, bark, and stone were viewed as, well, living beings.
It's fascinating how their culture wasn't just on the land, but flowed from it, particularly the mountains and waterways.
Exactly. Music, dance, oral traditions, these were the ways they expressed their values, emotions, and that vital connection to nature, fertility, rain. Rituals reinforced social cohesion.
The sources mention protective figures too, POWs.
Yes, pals or corn mothers offering gentle healing, especially for babies. But for severe emergencies like war or pestilence, they apparently coerced individuals believed to have greater power into providing human sacrifices.
Wow, that's a stark contrast.
It is. Reflects the pressures they likely faced.
And tragically, that small pre-European population, estimated at less than 10,000.
Dropped dramatically after contact. By the mid-1700s, the sources note the Caribs had largely moved away, and the population was predominantly African, brought by the horrific system of slavery. Today, only a small number identify as pure Carib.
Which leads us directly into the next very turbulent chapter, the arrival of the Europeans.
Indeed.
The earliest recorded European sighting of the sources mentioned was December 13th, 1498, Columbus's fourth voyage.
Right. It was initially named La Desirade, later Santa Lucia after Saint Lucy. But crucially, the Spanish didn't immediately settle or exploit it.
Why not?
Well, while Spain claimed it as part of their vast West Indies domain in 1511, like other Lesser Antilles, it remained largely undeveloped by them for a long time. Few Spanish visitors, mostly friars, left minimal trace beyond some anglicized geographic names.
But they did eventually do some things.
Yes, the sources mention Spanish establishing churches, fishing ports, planting orchards after the 1530s, and crucially, starting to capture and transport enslaved people from other islands, dipping into the early sugar trade.
And the Spanish saw Saint Lucia's location as a threat, right? A haven for pirates.
Exactly, preying on their crucial New World route, which led to Spanish attacks. Even after a peace agreement was reached, the British continued sugar cultivation on nearby islands. Despite Spanish claims and laws, it was always tense.
And just inherently strategic, a stopover point.
Definitely. Its location made it a frequent stopover for ships heading towards the Spanish Main. The sources note the island's challenging coast caused many shipwrecks, like the one at Anse-Cochon, recorded in British accounts in 1626.
And that strategic importance is precisely why this island became the focus of that intense, multi-generational conflict between the British and French.
The sources really frame this as a tug-of-war.
Yeah. It wasn't just land, it was valuable naval and military real estate, and a perfect base for privateers hunting shipping.
Early explorers certainly recognized its potential. Columbus was apparently interested in his water supplies for a potential supply station and its craggy peaks as lookouts.
Did he actually land, though? Sources differ.
Yeah. The sources note he claimed it on his second journey in 1493, though other accounts suggest he only got close without actually landing. Hard to know for sure.
But the French definitely took a closer look. Jacob Dumas.
Yes, conducted the island's first thorough cartographic analysis for France in 1643, calling it a potential jewel in the crown of France. That really solidified French ambition.
And kicked off the chaos.
Pretty much. And that ambition sparked the extraordinary struggle. The sources highlight a truly staggering statistic. Saint Lucia changed hands 14 times between France and Britain.
14 times. Can you imagine living through that?
No, a record for any Caribbean island. Think about the instability that created. Just listing a few transitions gives you the picture. French settled in 1651, British took it in 1663, French back in 1668.
And it just kept going.
Relentlessly, often tied to European wars, of course.
Including the French taking official possession in 1657 and naming it after Louis XIV. Then the British capturing Castries in 1759.
Exactly. Treaties like the Treaty of Paris in 1763 had Britain renouncing claims, only for the island to be returned to the French in 1783.
French attempts to hold on to it continued, like the 1796 siege of Fort Charlotte.
Right, before the British finally took it over and declared it a colony in 1803. But even then, the back and forth wasn't quite over. The sources list changes all the way into the mid-19th century, with final transfer to Britain noted in 1856.
And this wasn't just paper shuffling. Real
It's
fighting.
definitely not peaceful bureaucracy. These were real conflicts. The sources mention the Caribbean War of 1778-83, major naval battles like British Admiral Rodney's victory in 1782, and sieges of forts like Fort Saint Lucia, also known as Fort Charlotte. It was a brutal period of tactical maneuvering and heavy losses.
So after the 1814 cession to Britain, things settled down a bit, or just shifted.
Well, the sources describe a period of instability as the British established their colonial government. A governor, a council in London, the whole structure. Attorney General, Lieutenant Governor.
Stay up shop.
Basically. But the judicial system was a particular challenge initially. It was based on the French civil court model, but the British administrators, well, they lacked knowledge of criminal law.
Seriously, what happened?
Apparently, it led to situations where criminals had immunity for a time until justices of the peace were appointed. A bit messy, but the sources are clear. After 1814, France and Spain no longer had claim.
So Saint Lucia, despite its late European sighting, was settled relatively early, 17th century. And its location and resources, cotton first, then sugar.
Made it tragically ideal for the brutal plantation economies that define the Caribbean.
And that pivot to sugar meant
the rapid introduction of African slavery. The sources note initial attempts to use Caribs as enslaved labor, but a steady, massive influx of Africans began from the 1670s.
And it was dangerous work, but escape was possible.
Yes, incredibly dangerous, but the sources highlight that many successfully escaped into the dense forests, becoming known as Maroons. Their descendants, it's noted, still exist today, which is remarkable.
The scale, though. It's heartbreaking. The sources say the peak under French occupation saw about 85,000 Africans transported.
85,000. And they initially relied somewhat on white labor for sugar estates, but that declined sharply in the early 1700s, and the enslaved population numbers just exploded.
The figures are stark. 500 blacks in 1763, over 7,000 by 1776.
And get this, the sources state the British imported over 9 times more enslaved Africans than the French over about a century and a half.
9 times, just staggering.
It created a society built entirely on the arduous work of sugar production with a deeply stratified labor hierarchy. The sources describe Saint Lucia as arguably the most stratified society in the New World.
A tiny number of white planters dominating a vast enslaved population.
Exactly. And to maintain that dominance, planters relied on oppressive laws. The 1813 Slave Enactment is mentioned specifically for muffling unrest and establishing harsh punishments even for things like having children, perceived idleness, or any defiance.
But the enslaved population wasn't just passive victims.
No, absolutely not. The sources note their awareness of resistance movements elsewhere in the Caribbean and describe their own rebellious impulses and attempts to escape at every opportunity. They use their skills, the island's geography, those mountains and rivulets we talked about, and even leverage the ongoing conflicts between the colonial powers.
Clever. And passive resistance, too.
Yes, that's documented as well. Anything to push back.
And external influences mattered, like Haiti.
A powerful external influence was the Saint Domingue Revolt of 1795. Inspired by a voodoo priest, rumors of that freedom struggle spread quickly, sparking a revolt in Saint Lucia as well, though the sources say it was ultimately suppressed by the militia.
Meanwhile, back in Europe.
Right. Active campaigns against slavery gained momentum from the late 1790s, and the French Revolution's abolition of slavery had a significant impact.
Liberty and equality for all men.
Exactly. That wasn't just abstract. The sources say it took on real, tangible significance for the enslaved population in Saint Lucia, fueled by propaganda networks operating from London.
So the pressure was building from multiple directions.
Definitely. The early 19th century saw the anti-slavery movement grow, influenced by missionaries like the Wesleyan. This led to abolition agitation in the 1820s.
Did Britain just give in then?
Not immediately. They started by regulating St. Lucia's slave society, placing limits on work time and intensity. Perhaps, as a way to manage unrest, while resisting full abolition initially.
Delaying tactics.
Could be seen that way. But the moment of emancipation, when it finally came, the sources describe it as incredibly moving.
How so?
By 1834, figures like a missionary and others had convinced the population of the coming freedom. Mass meetings culminated on August 27, 1834. Thousands reportedly marching towards Castries with candles, prayers, hymns, and their few possessions, while planters waited anxiously.
Wow, that must have been an incredible sight.
You can only imagine. The sources note that fortunate communication and the quick phrase of the proclamation led to immediate and almost total freedom for the people on the island.
Almost total.
Well, it's worth noting, one source includes a perspective, and we have to remember these are historical accounts with potential biases that some of the former slaves were later described as ungrateful and suffered terribly.
That's complex. Shows freedom didn't solve everything overnight.
Exactly. A reminder of the difficulties and maybe differing viewpoints even then. Full emancipation across British territories came later, in 1848.
So 1838 abolition legally transitioned Saint Lucia from a slave society to one based on free wage labor.
Right. But the sources highlight a significant continuity. While labor changed, plantation ownership and the control over black workers largely remained.
The new slavery.
That's how planters apparently viewed it, yeah. Dictated by economic procedures rather than outright ownership.
And politically? Any changes?
An interesting step forward came quickly. The first elections in the British Caribbean colonies happened just a year after emancipation. This dramatically increased the number of potential voters.
But with strings attached.
Oh, yes. The sources note that suffrage was still regulated by things like education, property ownership, and community membership. And elections at this time are described as belligerent.
Oh, I bet. Economically, what happened to sugar?
It began a slow decline after 1820. The sources cite loss of the sugar bounty, soil exhaustion, poor management, lack of diversification, a familiar story in some ways.
So by abolition in 1834.
The number of functioning estates had actually halved.
Wow. And other related industries.
The sources note the rum industry was gone by 1881, sugar factories closed, and estates were increasingly broken up into small plots.
And the planters' response.
Facing this economic shift, they relied heavily on the judiciary as their primary tool to maintain control over the black working population. That's a really insightful detail about how power structures adapt.
It really is.
Yeah. The world economy shifted unexpectedly for the planters, too. Sugar lost its global monopoly in the latter half of the 19th century.
So what happened to the former slaves? Where did they work?
After the dissolution of the enforced gang system by 1836, former slaves were often allotted small parcels of land called provision ground.
To grow their own food.
Exactly. And maybe some cash crops like limes or cocoa. Although the sources imply the wages for the remaining plantation tasks were often very low for intense work.
So social conditions were pretty tough.
Not surprisingly, they fluctuated with the economy. Freed Africans were largely dissatisfied, seeking not just freedom but land, true independence, and equality.
Did the planters try to appease them?
Well, they increased spending on social services like schools for blacks and mulattoes, but the sources note little real improvement for the poor masses.
And this led to unrest.
In the 1860s and 70s, as the agricultural economy faltered further, though some white Creole merchants involved in sugar still got rich, this period saw increased agitation among the black population for democratic institutions and access to free land, partly inspired by the earlier Haitian Revolution.
Interesting connection.
Yeah. The sources suggest that in response, planters offered further increases in social services. This pressure eventually led to Parliament being broadened to include more elected members, and the sources indicate that this helped quell some of the agitation, at least for a time.
Now, there was an odd experiment mentioned, Chinese laborers.
Ah, yes, the Chinese coolie laborers. An intriguing, though short-lived episode. They were sought after because other sources of labor weren't readily available for cane planting.
But they were hesitant.
Very. The labor trade was sanctioned with China, but the Chinese workers were apparently reluctant, fearing servitude.
Understandable. So how did they convince them?
They were only willing to come, the sources say, when they were explicitly assured freedom to work in the forests or pursue any occupation they chose. A company, the Saint Lucia Coolie Guide Company, was even established in Hong Kong.
Really?
Yep. Ships began arriving in 1855, and the laborers were indeed dispersed into the forests. But the numbers were relatively small compared to other West Indies colonies, only about 967 between 1855 and 1879. The British abandoned the experiment around 1880. Didn't quite work out as planned, it seems.
Okay, moving into the 20th century, still sugar dominated.
Largely, yes, in the early decades, and that dependency led to problems. Following World War I, the sources note growing working-class unrest fueled by low wages and poor conditions.
Culminating in a big strike.
Exactly, a significant mass strike in 1937.
And that had consequences.
It was pivotal. It led to the establishment of the Labor Commission in 1939, whose findings formed the basis for the Labor Code, aimed at regulating labor relations and improving conditions in agriculture and industry.
What about World War II? Any impact?
Yes, a U.S. military base was set up near Castries, and the U.S. contributed resources to British naval bases, primarily to monitor German submarines. However, the war disrupted trade and meant food shortages persisted into the post-war period.
And politically, that earlier unrest had an effect.
Oh, definitely. That labor unrest of the 1930s really awakened political consciousness on the island. The Labor Commission recommended constitutional changes to broaden who could vote and increase the number of elected representatives.
And that happened.
Governor Turner implemented reforms in 1944, increasing elected members from 3 to 5 and linking the right to vote to property ownership and literacy. Still limited, but the sources call this the dawn of a new political era.
Interesting. And local politics itself.
Political activity in the early 20th century was competitive, even described as a source of entertainment by the sources.
Really?
Apparently so. 4 competing parties emerged, based on different interest groups like sugar cocoa producers, planters, yeomanry farmers, cooperative societies. Frequent changes in allegiance and voting patterns were apparently viewed with interest and even joy by the populace.
Huh. Sounds lively. And this local engagement eventually led to independence.
It grew into the independence movement, yes. The 1960s saw advancements in political status, part of the wider international movement towards self-determination and decolonization.
Britain tried a federation first, right? The West Indies Federation.
It did, formed in 1958, but the sources suggest it was doomed to failure due to the diverse interests of the various islands. Didn't last long.
So islands like Saint Lucia went their own way.
Pretty much. Local agitation led to an independence constitution being drafted, passed in December 1966. It established an executive responsible to an elected legislature and created the office of Governor General.
So almost independent.
They became an associated state of Great Britain from 1967, gaining internal self-government, a big step.
And the final push.
Inspired by other lesser Antillean territories getting full independence, Premier Sir John Compton announced the intention to the British authorities. Britain then announced independence would be granted by the end of 1979.
Were the negotiations smooth?
The sources mentioned political negotiations leading up to this, involving the key parties, the UWP and SLP. There were differing views on the approach joint request versus the old colonial process.
And some friction.
The sources note that negotiations faced challenges due to a focus on personal power, suggesting independence was ultimately granted partly to give local leaders a free hand in shaping the new nation. Make of that what you will.
Interesting framing. And the date.
February 22nd, 1979. Saint Lucia became fully independent.
And elections followed.
The sources clarify that while elections were announced for later that year, maybe to coincide with celebrations, independence itself was on February 22nd. The election saw a Labour Party landslide, winning all 17 seats, and Sir Malcolm Leontis took control as Prime Minister.
And the early days of nationhood.
Involved some political reforms, changing the Parliament House. The new constitution guaranteed freedoms, but the sources note the early period was marred by unrest over various grievances, including the abrogation of the local labor council.
And the style of government.
The new Republican style was apparently deemed too flamboyant by some. Initial turbulence.
But progress was made.
Yes. Despite that, the sources mention improvements in infrastructure, housing, healthcare, and education in the post-independence era. A notable point is the appointment of the first female Governor General, Dame Perlett Louise, although this occurred later, in 1997.
Right. And building a nation that takes effort.
Huge effort. Nation building included formal ceremonies and vibrant celebrations across the island, religious events, cultural festivals, youth activities, music, choirs, costumes, plays, dances.
There's a quote in the sources.
Yes, from a national speech that beautifully captures the spirit. Saint Lucia is a land of 1,000 miracles, a crossroad of the world where the cultures of Europe, Africa, and the East meet.
Lovely.
This whole process was about unifying languages, shaping a national identity, and building pride through national days and state symbols.
Which brings us right up to the modern era, post-1979 independence.
Exactly. Sir John Compton remained a central figure, serving as Prime Minister for many years and returning to power with a landslide victory in 1982.
And the political system today.
Saint Lucia operates as a parliamentary democracy with a bicameral legislature. The sources named the key political players as the SLP and UWP.
And it's been stable.
Well, there have been significant electoral shifts, like the SLP's victory in 1997 and the UWP's sweeping win in a snap election in 2001. But the modern era has also seen periods of significant unrest.
Like what?
The sources highlight public outrage and large protests following the sexual assault and murder of teenager Tiesha Sassy in July 2006. A really terrible event.
That happened amidst other problems.
Yes, what the sources describe as a murder epidemic and rising crime rates. The SLP government reportedly sought a snap election, but was denied by Governor General Louis C. Uproar continued over proposals to remap constituencies.
Other tensions.
The sources also note Prime Minister Kenny Anthony's public annoyance over a travel ban related to select Muslim-majority nations, causing further uproar. They describe a period with widespread misinformation where the populace struggled to get a clear view of events.
And some strong labels were used.
Yes, and again, it's important to note, this is a specific strong viewpoint found in the sources, reflecting opinions during that period of turmoil. Calls for resignation and riots led to Saint Lucia being termed a failed state by some.
Okay, important context. And this difficult period continued.
The sources indicate political competition and economic political malaise continued into the late 80s as well. Not always smooth sailing.
Right. Economically, though, the big story is tourism.
Unquestionably. The defining shift in the modern era is the move to tourism as the primary engine. Politicians reportedly envisioned tourism as the economic base back in the 1970s.
So hotels, resorts.
Exactly. Built often initially in wood to blend with local style, and the capital gained a five-star hotel.
But concerns have arisen.
Though the sources also voiced concerns about more recent concrete and steel developments potentially impacting the island's natural beauty, and a worry that excessive greed might overshadow responsible development, a common tension.
Yeah, and specific markets, weddings.
The growing wedding and honeymoon market is highlighted as a significant part of this, providing income not just for hotels, but also benefits for local farmers, performers, and artisans.
It's still relatively new, though.
The sources note tourism is still relatively new to the island, with significant potential for growth. It really took off after WWII with air travel development, leading to new resorts and promotion.
But setbacks occurred. Volcanic eruptions.
Yes, the sources point out that volcanic eruptions between 1979 and 1981 nearly devastated the industry, and it took over 20 years to fully recover.
Wow. And competition.
Increased international competition and more air travel options elsewhere have also impacted St. Lucia's customer base, highlighting a constant need to, adapt and upgrade.
So different models are discussed, mass market versus eco.
Exactly. The sources discuss different potential tourism models, the traditional package Sunsea Sand approach versus targeting eco-tourists or higher-spending clientele. They see the island's natural beauty as a major strength.
But it needs careful management.
Crucially, suggesting it has the potential to outweigh some social and environmental challenges if managed well. That if is key.
And the impact on the local economy is huge.
Massive. Tourism has undergone extensive commercialization globally, and in the Caribbean, it's the principal sector main source of foreign exchange, revenue, employment.
And St. Lucia stands out.
The sources highlight St. Lucia specifically for successfully developing tourism into a large and important industry, both for the island and the wider region.
Any specific numbers?
Looking at the data from 1999 mentioned in the sources gives a clear picture. Tourism accounted for roughly 65% of GDP, 80% of foreign exchange earnings, generated significant consumption and export revenue.
Visitor numbers.
Around 250,000 visitors annually then, mostly from the U.S. and Canada, with a notable increase in cruise ship arrivals.
But here's a critical point from the sources. Despite tourism's economic dominance, the island remains almost entirely dependent on imported food.
Yes, that's a major vulnerability. Local agricultural production is largely limited to fruits and vegetables. This raises concerns about sustainability and the fragility of agriculture as tourism continues to grow.
Local crafts benefit, though.
Definitely. Local craft businesses working with wood, coconut, clay, textiles, jewelry, cater to the tourist market.
And tourism is resilient.
The sources note that during a past economic crisis, while some figures were questioned, tourism was the least impacted sector, highlighting its importance. Despite some adverse factors at the time, over 700,000 tourist arrivals in 1999 was a record high.
So beyond tourism, what else is there? Agriculture still matters.
Agriculture, particularly bananas, coconuts, cocoa, and flowers, is still described as the backbone of the traditional economy, though its relative importance is definitely diminished.
Anything else?
Shipping and light manufacturing also play a role. And the sources highlight the presence of exclusive financial institutions, banks providing a safe haven for assets and generating foreign exchange, offshore finance.
Okay. But with all this development, especially coastal tourism, comes significant environmental pressure.
Huge pressure. The sources detail severe threats St. Lucia faces, particularly from climate change. increasing droughts, intense rainfall, flooding, erosion, landslides, habitat destruction, and pollution. A worrying list.
And the coasts are especially vulnerable.
Yes, because most urban development is low-lying and right on the coast. Sea level rise, the sources warn, will cut into the coastline and inundate drainage systems.
Are there projections?
Projections for 2050, based on a modest 0.5-meter sea rise plus increased weather intensity, show potential losses of over half the beach area, significant wetland habitat, entertainment areas, and coastal structures like groins.
That's alarming.
It is. Intense heat waves are also projected. Increased hurricane intensity is expected, although frequency might decrease, plus risks from cyclones forming over warmer oceans nearby.
And this hits the economy directly.
Absolutely. The sources stress the island's economic vulnerability is compounded by high energy and water prices and these growing climate change impacts.
Affecting farming and fishing, too.
Directly, agriculture, fishing, and aquaculture face challenges from the fragile ecosystem, soil erosion, water pollution, changing conditions, land development, landfills, runoffs, pollute bays, and coastal waters. Extreme weather events alone cause millions in damage, and it's noted that detailed environmental data can be hard to come by.
So what's being done? Conservation efforts.
On the conservation side, the sources mention measures involving international collaboration and partnerships, with external support providing financial and technical help.
What are the priorities?
Key areas for conservation strategies focus on addressing coastal and marine degradation, climate vulnerability, unplanned coastal development, and unsustainable resource exploitation.
Are there specific policies?
Specific policies are mentioned, like the National Fishery Policy, a National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, and land use and physical development plans. Institutions have also been established to protect natural and cultural resources.
But the threats remain significant.
Oh yes. Threats to biodiversity are extensive. Habitat loss from agriculture, charcoal production, housing, tourism, alien species, fires, unsustainable extraction, poor waste management, pollution, climate change. It's a lot.
Why is conserving habitats so important?
It's crucial not just for ecological functions, land, water, soil, but also directly for income generation through things like ecotourism. The sources mention past successes like films raising awareness and celebrating biodiversity, and tree planting initiatives by NGOs and the private sector. So there is work happening.
Good to hear. Now, turning to cultural heritage, the sources really link Saint Lucia's unique blend to its colonial past, right? Oppression shaping culture.
Very strongly. That mix of European, African, and even Amerindian traditions forged in that difficult history is evident everywhere in language, music, dance, food.
Language is a great example. French Creole.
Widely spoken, yeah. Heavily influenced by French and African languages, with rhythm and syntax reportedly drawing from native tongues. The sources note it has distinct idioms compared to other islands, and retains many French words even within the English-based Creole. It's a living blend.
And music and arts.
Incredibly vibrant, with roots tracing back to West Africa via Europe. The blending of different African tribes and later indentured laborers created a rich tapestry. Specific musical styles emerged from the plantation experience, European influences, and the Catholic Church.
Vaval is mentioned specifically.
Yes, Favel, which originated from Mardi Gras, is highlighted as Saint Lucia's most recognized musical heritage. It's predominantly Creole and linked to the Caribbean political carnival, but the sources say its spirit is deeply sociocultural and predates similar mass displays elsewhere.
And calypso.
A prominent art form used in drama and other expressions. It's often satirical, sometimes incorporating profanity, reflecting its role in social commentary.
But there's some tension there, tradition versus new styles.
The sources mention a dynamic tension, yeah, noting that current practitioners sometimes stray from established traditions with more spontaneity or a different stylistic approach, which can cause resentment among patrons who prefer the older styles. That kind of evolution happens everywhere, I suppose.
True. Was there a particular period of flourishing?
There was a notable cultural renaissance starting in the mid-1970s. The Poetry Society was formed in 1981, leading to publications and bringing poets like John Robert Lee to wider attention.
And a writers' competition.
Yes, the Saint Lucia National Trust launched a young writers competition in 1988. The manuscripts from this are housed in the Saint Lucia Fowler collection.
Described as?
Described by the sources as a linchpin of Saint Lucia's censored literary tradition. That phrase itself is powerful, isn't it? Hinting at a history where certain forms of expression faced challenges or suppression.
Definitely makes you think. Playwrights were active too.
Very active in the 1980s. The sources mention groups like Theatre Perpetual and the Carib Theatre Workshop, and highlight specific names like Ivan B.E.J. Jane Baptiste, Clover Hennigan, Joseph Marie, and others. A real hub of activity.
And music recording.
The 1980s also saw growth in local music recording, with artists like M.P. Walcott and Roy McFarlane, supported by record stores. Recording sounds were being captured by figures like Dr. David Monroe. Forms of worship through music also continued, with groups like Sunoco and Rihanna done Saint Lucia noted.
And you can't talk about St. Lucian culture without mentioning its festivals and traditions.
Absolutely not. The sources emphasize their vital role, full of music, singing, dancing, celebration throughout the year. Each festivity often has a spirit unique to its locality, tied to historical roots and customs.
Stemming from
Early settler beliefs, African heritage, religious or agricultural events, it's all mixed together.
And the big one is Carnival.
The most renowned is Carnival in July. While the season builds for months, July is the intense crescendo described as excitement, revelry, parades, costumes, dances, music that feels larger than life, transcending reality.
Sounds incredible.
Yeah, a time for immersion and fantasy, fostering camaraderie and community spirit with soca and calypso music at its core.
Other festivals?
Other significant ones mentioned include the Fisherman's Feast, Festival of Light, the Folk and Jazz Festival, Independence Day, Christmas, and Juning Quayle, or Creole Day.
So lots going on.
Absolutely. These are opportunities to share customs, food, costumes with distinct local celebrations like Jouvert in specific towns, adding to the vibrant tapestry.
Wow. It's been quite the journey through St. Lucia's story, hasn't it?
It really has. From those early indigenous communities through the relentless European struggle for control, the brutal reality of the slave trade and plantation life,
The path to emancipation and the challenging post-slavery society, the fight for independence.
and its modern reality grappling with the dominance of tourism, significant environmental threats, and that incredible cultural vibrancy born from hardship. It's a lot to take in.
And seeing how all those layers of history, from conflict to cultural blending, directly shaped the island you see today, really comes through when you dive into sources like these.
It certainly does, and these sources leave us with a powerful question to consider, I think.
Which is?
St. Lucia's history is undeniably marked by overcoming immense hardship. That journey has led it to a place of undeniable beauty and tourism potential in the modern world. But, and it's a big but, in a global economy driven by powerful forces, can this relatively small island truly overcome its deep-seated historical economic challenges and the pressures of modern exploitation?
You mean things like?
Well, the sources point to things like large hotel chains, potentially altering the geography, contributing to pollution, or even displacing local populations. Does the island's potential for being a tropical paradise ultimately outweigh the significant economic and environmental difficulties it faces?
A test case, maybe.
The material suggests St. Lucia might serve as a test case for other similar islands trying to navigate this incredibly complex modern world. It definitely gives you, the listener, a lot to think about regarding the future of places like this.